gone. Okay, thank you, Tomas. I forgot, I had read that torturous sentence structure article of yours. That turned out so beautifully. You accepted whatever mark I put on it. And of course it was published in no time. So thank you for that nice introduction. Yes, I did. I was in graduate school with Tomas. Angie, there's just a couple places. Oh, okay, don't call attention to your daughter. In graduate school at the University of New Mexico. And then in 1989, I went to Boise, Idaho, and taught history there for 21 years. And I came back, this is perfect, I came back because these two women that are just walking in, daughters, and they each have a granddaughter, and I have a son nearby in Durango. So, long family ties, because I came to New Mexico, well, not long compared to many others, but I came here in '77, we all did. And then I knew all the time I was in Boise, which was a great job and a wonderful place to live, but I knew I'd be back here.
Some would like you to use the microphone.
Some would like that, okay. Let me move it. Get it situated here. All right, is that better? Is it too close?
No.
Okay. At any rate, I came back to Santa Fe about 2 years ago this time. And to tell you the truth, this is the first, it's not the first talk I've given, but it's the first time I've had to do some new research. So it was pretty interesting how I got myself kick-started to come here to the archives, to go to the state archives, to go online, all those things one has to do to and find out new information. So please bear in mind that what I have today is, as we historians call it, a work in progress, because what I did find brought up a lot of questions and a lot of roads in other directions. So I think that I have a topic here that I might pursue for publication as an article. At any rate, I did title it, it was rather vague a year ago when Tomas asked me to speak about what direction my talk would take, so the second part of the subtitle is really the way it's been published. But let me begin with this quote. "If women could only vote, New Mexico would be a state by now," declared Genevieve Longfield Lane. She was president of the GAR, Grand Army of the Republic. Okay, I see some nods. I didn't know much about it. But she came to Albuquerque and spoke to a very enthusiastic audience on April 7th, 1909, just, not too long before statehood. Lane was from Chicago. She was an ardent suffragist worker, and she went on to say, quote, "I think all the women in the country are in favor of statehood, and if the women were represented in Congress by members of their own sex, the territory would have been admitted long ago." Boy, isn't that familiar? This was the sentiment, of course, shared by many New Mexicans for nearly 6 decades, in which they had been thwarted continually in their efforts to achieve statehood. Lane delivered these remarks to a mixed audience, what the 19th century people referred to as a promiscuous audience. I always find that kind of interesting. To a mixed audience of women of the John A. Logan Circle, of the ladies of the GAR, and men who were referred to as the comrades of the G.K. Warren Post of the GAR. So a few words about the Grand Army of the Republic. It is a fraternal organization of veterans of the Civil War. It was founded by General John A. Logan in Decatur, Illinois, 40 miles from where I grew up, oddly enough, in 1866. Although there are other groups that claim credit for the founding of this organization, it was still the first organized advocacy group in American politics. And as you might imagine, they lobbied for the rights of veterans, most particularly for veteran pensions and for the rights of voting for the newly freed African American men. The GAR became a de facto political arm of the Republican Party during the Reconstruction era, and apparently if you were going to run for political office, you couldn't really get elected if you didn't have their support. And in fact, 5 U.S. presidents belonged to the Grand Army of the Republic. 2 years after it was founded in 1868, General Logan established May 30th as Decoration Day. Remember that term? And that, the point of that was to visit cemeteries and put flowers and flags on the graves of veterans. We now know that holiday as Memorial Day because in 1967, Congress declared the last Monday in May as Memorial Day, and that then became part of a 3-day weekend, and people then and now assume it is a day to remember all the deceased rather than just veterans. But General Logan wanted, particularly to think about veterans, which we have just done here Sunday and Monday. At its peak, the GAR claimed nearly 500,000 members in 1890, so it's a pretty influential political organization. Now, I'm going on about the GAR enough, but there is one notable mention I want to make, and that is the fact that although this was a male organization, there was one female member. It was Sarah Emma Edmonds. She served in the 2nd Michigan Infantry in the Civil War for 2 years, disguised as a man, named Franklin Thompson. And this wasn't unusual. Probably Civil War people know that. Women frequently went to war disguised as men, or came west disguised as men, from various other situations. But for Edmonds, she thought she served well and ably, and so she lobbied for the veterans' pension, and she received it. It took her about 20 years, but she got it in 1884, and 15 years later, she got admitted to the Grand Army Republic. Now, that organization did pass out of existence when the last member died, 1956. But, we have other organizations that honor veterans, most particularly the Veterans of Foreign Wars and American Legion. My remarks today will take a look at the events prior to 1909 and Genevieve Lane's claim that New Mexico would be a state by now if only women could vote. The question I sought to answer is this: what were New Mexico women doing, if anything, regarding efforts to get New Mexico out of territorial status and into statehood credibility? I discovered that the answer is complicated, and to try to understand it, that we need to look at the larger political picture of the 19th century. But in my research, and pull up the next slide, I discovered 4 really major threads or strands that wound themselves together that underlie the things that were going on prior to New Mexico statehood, and that's where I'll focus today. As you can see, abolition, of course, was over by, or at least the movement for abolition for the ending of slavery ended in 1865 with the passage of the 13th Amendment, which gave about 2 million American or African American men the right to vote. But both temperance and female suffrage, and I use those terms because that's how they were referred to in the 19th century, continued to be major themes in politics and women's lives until the early 20th century, when the 18th Amendment was passed. In 1917, that was the Prohibition Amendment, prohibited the manufacturing, distribution, and sale of alcohol, but you might notice, not the consumption. And the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote in 1920. And the Women's Club movement then kind of see that as a foundation that underlies these other 3 issues and provides a forum for women's growing political activism. So let's step back and try to weave these strands together as they concern New Mexico. And I'm going to just step over here and get clean. This comes from a little bit of chill in the room. As early as the 1830s, Eastern women were organizing in small groups around prohibition because around prohibition of alcohol, because, of course, they daily saw the damage it caused to family and home life. Drunkenness in their husbands, domestic abuse, family income spent at the local saloons, loss of job by the breadwinner husband, and sometimes desertion. All right, the next slide. The earliest organizations began in the churches. but soon spread to the streets. And I'm sorry, I didn't get this bigger, but I'll tell you in a minute about it, where small groups of women sang and prayed outside the saloons. You can imagine how that went over. But the saloon, a real symbol of manhood, a male place, a man cave, we may call it, in the 21st century. But it had long been an enemy to the sanctity of the home and the family. And this woman is Carrie Nation, in case you didn't notice the hatchet in her hand. And the bottom slide showed some damage that she and other women did to various saloons and drinking establishments in Kansas. She was quite well known in Kansas. The Prohibition movement grew over several decades, and many men joined the movement as well. It became a national movement in the 1870s with the emergence of the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1872. That organization grew to become the largest women's movement nationwide after 1879, when Frances Willard took over the leadership. She was a very effective politician. She was a woman who had foregone marriage and family to work for the cause, with a capital C. She was one of others, particularly a woman we'll meet in a moment, you already probably know of, but Susan B. Anthony, two women who gave their lives for the cause, temperance and suffrage, women's suffrage, because at that time, of course, it just wasn't possible that women could have what we know as a career or even a job and still be a mother and wife. But she was very effective. And that organization had a membership of almost 250,000 by 1911, and they'll play a major role in New Mexico's drive for statehood. Prohibition, of course, will be a major factor. So now let's look at the thread of female suffrage. This is about the birth of the American women's movement. It took place in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. Seneca Falls is a small village, or was a village then, probably just still a few thousand people today, in upstate New York, when a group of women gathered over, going over for coffee, or in their case, probably tea, one morning in the summer of 1848, to talk about the condition of women's lives, especially as regarded property rights. They met in the home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth is not nearly as well known as Susan B. Anthony, but the two of them then became the leaders of the women's movement throughout the 19th century. You probably know on some level that women had few rights in the 19th century. From the moment that the colonists first landed, patriarchy ruled, and I mean that in the sense that the male was the leader of the home, the church, the public place, and all. Women were considered to be dependents of men, so they had no individual rights. They were considered, like children, dependents of husbands, or fathers, or brothers, and even sons if they were widowed. They could not own property. They could not serve on juries. They could not bring a lawsuit. They could not inherit other than the legally mandated widow's 1/3. And of course, they couldn't vote. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton's story tells us a little bit about how these drawbacks, or these grievances really, came to initiate the women's movement in the middle of the 19th century. She was of a middle-class family, educated as a young woman in Boston. Her father was an attorney, and when she married an attorney too. But while she was growing up, she spent a lot of time in her father's office. And time and again, she heard women come to her father pleading for his help, for her to leave a drunken husband, a bad marriage, violence, conflict, you name it. And there were very little ways to leave a situation like that in the 19th century. Divorce was really hard to obtain. And Elizabeth heard her father say, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Jones, but there's nothing legally I can do for you. You will just have to go home and try to keep the children safe and try to, protect yourself." And that stayed with Elizabeth as she grew up and became a very, very interested and engaged cultural figure in Boston. She was smart, she was very articulate, and a good thinker. She had a good mind, as we would say. So, I must mention too that a lot of these women that were involved in the women's suffrage came from the abolition movement itself. A lot of them, and that's when I mentioned the promiscuous audiences. Women weren't allowed to speak to mixed audiences like this. Prohibition movement began to break that down somewhat, but it was still pretty unusual for any woman to speak in front of a mixed audience in that time. Katie Stanton and Lucretia Mott, her cousin, were the two that had initiated this little get-together at Katie Stanton's home in the middle of July with a few other women, local women. What they decided to do was call a convention for 2 weeks forward and hold it at the Wesleyan Chapel there, which is now a National Historic Site. And they put a little ad in the local paper announcing it. And they had no idea if anyone would show up or how many, but 300 people did. And they came from all around that community. They came by wagon, by horseback, on foot, all sorts of ways to get there, to talk about women's conditions. So talk about a topic that's, the time has come to do something about. They were ready. Of that 300 people, 40 of them were men. They had plenty of male support. Frederick Douglass was one, a former slave who had become a really important and strong abolition speaker. Lucretia Mott, of course, as I mentioned, she was there. She was 15 or so, she was a generation probably older than Stanton, a Quaker woman. And so she was well aware of what could be for women, at least in the Quaker Church, women were treated equally with men, were allowed to speak, and so on. The women at that meeting often compared, and I suppose in general, at this time period, compared a woman's life to that of the enslaved. I'm going to quote from an 1849 speech that Lucretia Mott gave. "Woman has been so long subject to the disabilities and restrictions with her progress, which her progress has been embarrassed, that she has become enervated. Her mind, to some extent, paralyzed, and like those still more degraded by personal bondage, she hugs her chains." Next slide. This is a more modern cartoon, but it fits the message here, which I've copied at the top. Pretty bracelets. This three-day meeting produced a declaration of sentiments, pretty much written by Katie Stanton, and based on the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson, 100 years or more before. She was very much aware of Jefferson's situation when she wrote her declaration. She was 33, he was 33. She wanted her declaration to carry weight too. Well, we don't know it by heart today. We don't refer to it in the same way. But the resolutions that were passed were based on the language of the Declaration of Independence. And so where King George was mentioned in the Declaration of Independence, she substituted man. The women at the time, not just her, but they identified, quote, the enemy as the absolute tyranny of man, and noted his, quote, repeated injuries and usurpations. That's part of the language, that 19th century language that's in this list of sentiments. They were a declaration of reforms. It was the first women's reform movement in some ways. There were 18 resolutions. They all passed unanimously except for the 17th, and that was female suffrage. That was very controversial, even with the women and men present in that year, because for both, as I said, for them, because woman's place was so clearly outlined as a domestic one. She wasn't really expected to be or appreciated to be in the public sphere. And if women could vote, that would just get them involved in all this messy, dirty politics. That would, we know it's there. We just get in it now. And it might account for the 72 years it took for the women, American women, to get the vote, is the attitude, about men keeping women out of politics and not really wanting to share power, get that word over here in the microphone. The mothers of the movement, as they came to be known, were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Now, the two of them did not meet until about 3 years later at a women's rights conference in Ohio in 1851. They met on the street, one of those chance meetings that we sometimes have with people, and they hit it off, and thereafter then they were a team. Elizabeth was the one who was a mother. She had 5 or 6 children scrambling around her feet. Very little help. Middle-class families almost all had, help with the children in the house cleaning in those days. But she became the theorist. She was the one with the ideas that she took to a larger group, or to Susan to begin with. And Susan was the one that delivered them, because she too stayed, like Willard, she stayed single. And she traveled a great deal by railroad in the East and Midwest, and came out to the West several times, probably traveled by wagon out here for a while until the railroad came. And the two of them then led the women's rights movement from the 50s, 1850s, through the early part of the 19th century, or excuse me, 20th century. Susan was older, about 9 years older. She died in 1902. Elizabeth Cady Stanton died in 1906. And then a new generation of suffragists took over. Well, the interesting thing here, still for historians who teach anything about women's history and suffrage in our country, is that this movement that began in the East and slowly spread to the Midwest, not much at all in the South, but eventually came west. By the 70s and 80s, there were women out here, most particularly in Oregon. Abigail Scott Duniway, and Oregon, and of course Idaho was still a territory, and she traveled, and Washington traveled that whole area just repeatedly, trying to encourage the vote for women. The upshot of this is that the first states to pass suffrage at the national level, and I'm not talking about the states or the local level where women could serve on school boards and be appointed or elected state superintendents of schools, but at the federal level, that brought all the suffrage brought all voting rights that men had. It came first to 4 western states, and they are Wyoming, 1869, Utah, 1871. Those two, they were territories then, but became quickly, or at least Wyoming quickly became a state. Colorado in 1893, and of all things, the most red state in the nation today, Idaho, where I lived all those years and taught this. They had very effective women's rights movement in Idaho. They were smart politically because they contacted and visited with the 4 major party leaders, and that was the Republicans, the Democrats, the Populists, and the civil rights. Civil was a big issue in the States. Then nothing happened for on the state level for women's suffrage until 1910. Oh, I have a slide that makes this very obvious. You'll see when it comes up. I'm used to doing this little thing myself, so even my reminders I don't catch. Yeah. I don't know if you can read it very well, so I'll read it. A 1915 cartoon showing the western states where women had won the right to vote. Women in the East reach out to the Western women carrying a torch of liberty. So here's the Eastern women. All these figures are Eastern women. Here's the Western woman with the torch of liberty. Very stereotypical, a common image of woman dressed, partially dressed, and usually in white. And if you'll notice, all the Western states have granted suffrage to women, except this one right here. And that's us. That's us. Women and men in New Mexico were not immune to this issue, of course, and indeed, some political activism did occur during the territorial period. According to historian Joan Jensen, who wrote one of the few articles that I know about on suffrage in New Mexico in 1981, which is why I think there might be time for something new, or an addition. she wrote about wrote that New Mexico women's political history could be divided into 4 periods. Before 1890, as I've already talked about, there was little organized women's movement in New Mexico. From 1900 to 1920, we see that women did create political pressure and were gained the right to vote. Certainly every American woman by 1920. In the next 20 years, then women became voters and participants in state and local office holding here. And finally, Jensen says, since 1940, women are active in politics at all levels of government. And in fact, you know, we have the nation's first female governor now. She's the top of the political ladder in this state. You know, what's missing, of course, is still the White House. But the election, the recent election shows us that even the House and Senate, even Congress is increasing the numbers of women who've been elected to office there. We have 20 female senators now. So let's look at the 4th strand in the fabric of women's history, and that's the Women's Club movement. As I mentioned, throughout the 19th century, women had been gathering together for many reasons. The next slide, please. Yeah. Bible study, for example, in the churches. Mothers clubs, what they called mothers clubs, which were probably where they probably talked about, you know, advice and tips on how to raise children and husbands. Sewing clubs. I think or sewing clubs and literary clubs. And this one is a literary club, or that one was. This is the so-and-so club, and this is a little later in Las Cruces, but nevertheless. The Temperance League, abolition efforts, of course. By late in the 19th century, women were taking part in civic reform. We call that activity social housekeeping. And then they were beginning to, as I've said, talk about and organize for property rights for women and the vote. And this led to a growing club movement that in 1892 organized into the General Federation of Women's Clubs. So all the little local clubs of each state could then apply for membership in the GFWC, the Federation, okay? At the time when it was formed, there were 500 affiliated clubs and then over 100,000 members. And by World War I, there were over 1 million members to the General Federation of Women's Clubs. Mainly, I haven't talked much about class, but mainly this has been mainly middle-class women, white women, that entered political life, and they could do so without forsaking their domestic values. But also, very importantly, the organized women's club movement provided a structure that would allow them to exert political pressure on the 2 hot-button issues of the day, which, as I've said, were temperance and female suffrage. So now we begin to see some action in New Mexico via these groups. WCTU, the GAR, and the NAWSA, I always refer to it as NAWSA, not NASA, but NAWSA, National American Women's Suffrage Association, all included local chapters and established these chapters in small towns and even rural areas of New Mexico. The first women's clubs were established in Santa Fe and Las Cruces in 1892. From the clipping files here at the History Library, the New Mexican gave an account of the creation of the first women's club that year, quote, at a meeting of the ladies of Santa Fe, July 9th, 1892, in the World's Fair Rooms, Mrs. Bartlett moved that we organize as a benevolent association. Cora Bartlett was the wife of New Mexico's territorial solicitor general. And she was elected president from that small group of 8 white middle-class women who were present that day. Now, here's another thread that I want to follow up. This club was an outgrowth of the Women's Auxiliary of the World's Fair Committee. This was, of course, the Chicago Columbian Exposition in 1893, and all the states were invited to, and territories were invited to send displays. So the club's newly elected president, Cora Bartlett, quote, bore a conspicuous part in the women's work at the fair in her position as lady manager from New Mexico. Bartlett had planned and executed the New Mexico displays, which included a filigreed table, which came to be known as the World's Fair Table and became kind of a white elephant. I want to follow up on this too. It had been made by New Mexico craftsmen and was underwritten by the club. After the fair ended, as you may know, almost all the buildings were torn down. The place was just dismantled. And in this case of the table, it apparently was put up for sale in a shop in Chicago that someone here had a connection with, and it never sold. So I have to try to find out what happened to that table. If you've seen it, let me know. It's on display somewhere. Okay, next slide. At their second meeting, they changed the name of the Benevolent Association to the Women's Board of Trade, which is a kind of a strange name. But it was a counterpart to the Men's Board of Trade, which both of them are really like the Chamber of Commerce kind of organization today. And, as Tomas pointed out to me more recently, there is a plaque with this inscription on it upstairs in the rooms, the very rooms in which the women created the Women's Club. And there are 31 names, I think, on this plaque, and they cover the gamut of the well-known Anglo people here in Santa Fe. Katrin, Palin, Prince, Seligman, Twitchell. Those names might be familiar to you. The purpose then of the Women's Board of Trade was to make improvements and establish a library, and they did both. But they began with the plaza, which was described, quote, in this way: disreputable, surrounded by a dilapidated picket fence, sunken and rough. That's from the Santa Fe. The club spent about $1,500, really quite a large sum in those days, over the next few months on the transformation of the plaza. In 1992, the club celebrated 100 years of civic and charitable work, and this is how the New Mexican described that project. The board's first major project was to transform the Santa Fe Plaza from a scruffy square to a pleasant meeting place similar to its present state. Now, this was only about 20 years ago. The alfalfa, he's writing it 20 years ago. The alfalfa in the plaza was uprooted and grass, trees, flowers, and shrubs were planted. A new bandstand was built. Sidewalks and benches were put in place. And a policeman was hired to keep children and dogs under control. With the exception of that hired policeman, it sounds similar today. Another problem on the plaza, not so far removed from today though, was that of begging. An important part of their club work was to help Santa Fe's poor. To that end, within the first month, they put into place a plan to curb, quote, the beggar problem, unquote, as it had been known to visitors and locals since 1869. So quoting from the New Mexican, from that same 1892 article, comes this piece. And this was, what I'm quoting was written in the Times in the 1890s. In the dispensing of alms to the poor on Saturday mornings. In this matter, the ladies simply act for the businessmen who make them their agents. On Saturday last, 22 persons presented themselves with slips of paper from the merchants at the World's Fair committee rooms, where ladies distributed small sums of money and supplies of various kinds. The busy housewives thus devote the hours from 9 to 12 on Saturday mornings for the purpose of removing from the public streets and business houses a long recognized evil. Now that is laden with symbolism, of course, as you know, so I don't even have to explain that. I would add this. This plan was in marked response to Gene Hackman's recent efforts to help the poor down on the plaza. But establish a library they did in 1896. It was called the Free Public Library and Reading Room. And originally it was on the northwest corner of the plaza where the Museum of Fine Arts stands today. There were some barracks there also, and it was up on the second floor. But a few years later, the legislature granted them a piece of land here, I guess the land we're on now, on the corner of Washington Street, and the club began raising money. Governor Hagerman laid the cornerstone in 1907, and the opening reception was held in the building in January of 1908. The cost was $8,000. And unlike women's clubs in many cities and across the nation, there were no Carnegie funds involved here. Carnegie, offered monies to many, many cities to build libraries, and usually it was women's clubs and women's groups that wrote the grants to receive that money. But this time, all this money was raised by club members through their membership and through various fundraising activities. Another women's club established itself in Santa Fe in 1912 after statehood achieved. And it's interesting that we talk about the Santa Fe Women's Club and think of it as this early branch, but in truth, the Santa Fe Women's Club, as we know today, came later. And then the two clubs merged. The Women's Board of Trade and the Santa Fe Women's Club merged in 1931. They had similar goals, civic duties, charitable work, but the second Women's Club, by that name, was also very interested in literary and cultural events. And they're still in business, their buildings, I think that is a 1960s building out on the old Santa Fe, or the old Las Vegas. Vegas Trail, thank you. Vegas Trail. And in fact, they currently provide scholarships to New Mexico universities for New Mexico students. Support the boys' ranch, the girls' ranch, although I think one of those is out of business now, I'm not sure. The hospital's cancer treatment center, and they contribute to St. Elizabeth's shelter. So during the first decade of the 20th century, the number of small New Mexico Women's Club increased to the degree that a New Mexico territorial chapter of the Federation, General Federation of Women's Clubs, formed in 1905. And this included the local chapters and the auxiliaries of the WCTU, the GAR, and NASA, the Women's Suffrage Group. By 1911, delegates from 17 clubs formed the New Mexico Federation, anticipating that statehood would be granted the following year. And of course, it did work out that way. By then, the issues of women's suffrage and prohibition had become firmly intertwined. The process had begun, really, in the 1890s. For example, in a notice published in the Albuquerque Morning Democrat on September 10, 1893, members of both NASA and the WCTU called for, quote, a convention of all persons, men and women, interested in the cause of women's suffrage, is hereby called to meet in Albuquerque on Friday, September 22nd, 1893, for the purpose of organizing a New Mexico Association auxiliary to the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA. The notice also commented on the influence that women's suffrage would give them surrounding the then raging silver question espoused by the populist movement in the 1890s. So these weren't women thinking just about parks and libraries. They're thinking about complicated issues like the monetary issue of silver then. To continue with the quote, we consider it most opportune, wise, and necessary this year in view of our near admittance to statehood, and also because of the influence and weight our political equality will give to the great silver question of the hour. Let us make the silver states great in numerical strength and political power. That whole story, or that issue was about backing the dollar with silver instead of gold. And it would greatly have benefited the West, where there were a lot of silver mines and miners. But the populist movement was a movement too soon for its time, and within a decade or so had lost most of its political power. But the author of that notice, Mamie Marble, was the vice president of the New Mexico chapter of NASA, and she was acknowledging territorial legislative action occurring in 1892 and 93 and hoped that the clubs could use that their influence for suffrage, the calls for statehood. Now, the women of New Mexico were not without humor as regards their issues around suffrage. I know you've been told that feminists aren't funny, but we can be. In 1894, the same newspaper announced that, quote, the ladies of the WCTU of Santa Fe intend giving the play, and the name of the play is An Adjourned Session of the Legislature. To go on with the quote, one of the amusing features of this play is the presentation of a bill giving this right of suffrage to the men. Role reversal here. The Albuquerque Journal-Democrat reported in 1895, and I have a slide for this, one to look at, that Mrs. Johns is known to fame. Oh, excuse me, I skipped a little bit here. Let me introduce this woman. The following year, the woman suffrage issue found a way to San Felipe Pueblo when Mrs. Laura M. Johnson of Salinas, Kansas, arrived to give a speech on the topic. And the journal then reported 1895 that Mrs. John is known to fame as one who delivers oratorical honors comparable with Mrs. Mary Lease, but unlike the latter, is a Republican and has several times stumped the state of Kansas for the party. She's also an earnest advocate of equal suffrage and is a national speaker on this topic. She will likely return soon and deliver a lecture in Albuquerque on her favorite topic. Mary Lease was a popular speaker for the Populist Party. She is known most especially for the phrase, raise less corn and more hell. That was pretty kind of shocking in the 19th century. And like Carrie Nation, who was also working in Kansas, the two of them were raising hell. Not all New Mexicans, however, were in support of equal suffrage. From the Silver City Eagle comes this note from May 1896. The question of women's suffrage is being agitated in this territory, but the cause does not appear to have many enthusiastic supporters. Most of the ladies in New Mexico are willing to keep out of politics and leave campaign work to the men. It seems to us that this course is highly commendable. But throughout the early 1890s, then, Prohibition and women's suffrage groups kept their interests before the territorial legislature. During one legislative attempt to write a constitution, both groups met failure in securing provisions into the document to support their interests. Another slide here, Steele. And I don't know, can you read this? It's a little, all right. This is a political cartoon from a 19th century publication called Puck, 1901 and 02. National public opinion had been gradually shifting in favor of statehood since the mid-1890s. These cartoons use a common motif of maturing young girls dressed in regionally distinctive clothes, seeking to be treated as grown-ups and allowed to wear the new national garb of a state. The 1901 cartoon, this one is by Rose Cecil O'Neill, soon to become famous for creating the Cupid doll. So here again we have some of the same stereotypes. The half-dressed woman in white, the wise woman, and she is federal government, and she's holding out. You can't read this, but on the petticoat, on this dress, it says statehood, and here it says New Mexico. Well, look at New Mexico. Somewhere. Look how New Mexico is depicted here. Clearly, we have some ethnicity going on, and she's begging. Please let me in. And of course, ethnicity had been a major reason why, particularly people in the East and the politicians didn't support statehood for New Mexico because they didn't think Mexicans out here were up to it, to make good citizens in the state. That's a whole nother topic. You're still looking for speakers, are you?
Fine.
At any rate, prohibitionists were particularly bitter because a group of New Mexico people had insisted that the liquor interests in the territory had carried the day. This is the things that didn't pass. And they believed that the records would show that 15 of the territorial delegates were liquor dealers, maybe even as many as 20. Imagine that. One distraught WCTU member, a mother from Berlin, pleaded with legislators. Quote, "I ask you in the name of the Lord to help me put whiskey out of New Mexico. I have a boy and a girl to be protected, and a husband, and the saloon men have everything their own way, and if we don't do something, I do not know what will become of us." The anguish in this mother's plea echoes in Mary Austin's biography, Earth Horizon. Recalling her memories of domestic abuse associated with drunkenness, she wrote, quote, "What was known as hard liquor begot violence in drinkers and excited what was, for the women who made it, a violence of resistance. I remember a pretty German woman who used to bring her 3 children to our house to be left until their father recovered from, quote, one of his spells. I recall how she came one night with a great bloody bruise on her face, and my mother insisting on treating it with some sort of embrocation, and the unwiped tears on my mother's face while the 2 women kept up between them the pretense of a blameless accident. And then I remember Frances Willard." In Austin's, in this page, or in this part of her book, she makes the comment that she's going to talk about the violence and abuse that goes along with drunkenness, which in the 19th century, people were aware of it but didn't talk about it because drinking was so acceptable. And the rate of alcoholism and the rate of consumption of alcohol was extremely high in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's actually declined in the 20th, but Americans drank a lot. In May of 1909, the Roswell Register Tribune reported on the local option battle occurring in Santa Fe that spring. Quote, "That local option fight over at Santa Fe is assuming national proportions. The beginning of the scrap was when the WCTU secured the passage of an ordinance by the Santa Fe City Council giving the saloons a time limit of December 31st to get out of business. The booze men contended that the people did not want the drink dispensaries closed and sought to have the ordinance repealed. The city council then called an election to let the people vote on the matter." End of quote. Well, let me summarize a little bit about what took place. But the so-called booze men then sought an injunction to stop the election on the grounds that the council had no right to use city funds to defray the expenses of this election. But the newspaper goes on to report, quote, "The WCTU saw their bluff and also raised the bet by promptly putting up the funds to pay for the election, showing at the same time that the city had no funds and that it was an act of charity to both the liquor interests and the city to thus provide the sinews of war." Kind of an odd phrase there. Alas, in June of that year, quote, "Santa Fe voted wet. It was not and is not now a community that desires prohibition." That's not my words. I'm quoting. Apparently, the nation felt the same way, because the 18th Amendment was repealed in 1933. The only one of our amendments has ever been repealed. And one of the first acts by the newly elected President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was to celebrate with a cocktail in the White House. So, statehood then for New Mexico, as you know, finally arrived in January 1912. As David Holtby, in his new book, The 47th Star, so ably demonstrates, it was a long, messy, and complicated effort. As I hope to have shown here, women played major roles in the process as well. Another slide. This one's kind of interesting too, because, well, you can read what it says up here, but I find that we have the Hispanic, the Indian, and the Anglo represented by the 3 different states. And dressed as children, you know, now we're grown-ups enough to come into the Union. As temperance workers, suffrage activists, and club members, women brought local and community as well as national interest to the statehood process. Along the way, women became politicized, and as we know, have never looked back. Just one more slide. After New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, the prohibition and women's suffrage campaigns continued through World War I, culminating in the 18th and 19th Amendments to the Constitution and the forward growth and development of New Mexico in its first 100 years. Thanks. Comment about this slide. It's 3 generations of voters, and it was at least 3 or 4 generations that it took from 1848 to 1920 to get the vote. And also note the difference in dress styles and how they evolved over time. Probably this was early 20th century, and she looks like not a flapper yet, but a more modern new woman, and then their child. So, any questions? Yes.
Did you find out much about the amount of discussion there was to not include suffrage for women in
the state constitution?
Yeah.
I have not yet, but like I said, there's a lot of threads still being unwoven here. And I have talked to David Holtby, because he's now, quite the expert on, the most recent expert on history of statehood for the there were a lot of things that were involved, of course. Race was one of them, ethnicity was one. The high numbers of Hispanic politicians and citizens here. That was one thing that discouraged it. Cultural attitudes still, by 1912, had not changed. I mean, Alice Paul hadn't chained herself to the White House fence yet. She doesn't do that until 1916. To embarrass Woodrow Wilson, who's fighting for democracy overseas, but no democracy for women in America. That was essentially the gist of the movement then. And like the Prohibition Amendment, which I've always learned had to do with, and I guess maybe this is only part of it, providing corn for bread rather than for alcohol. Because we were starting we were becoming the breadbasket for the armies in Europe. And part of that Prohibition Amendment was to turn that industry to war work rather than local consumption. But it took then Wilson finally being persuaded by the NASA group, which was in great contrast to Alice Paul's group, the National Women's Party. I mean, they were continually embarrassing the president, and the more moderate middle-class organization of National American Women's Association were trying to, finesse it. And the president saw the lesser of two evils finally, I suppose in one sense, and came around then and supported suffrage. And when he did, then Congress began to discuss it and pass it. It was very, very close in both houses, both the House and the Senate. And in fact, it was only due to a Tennessee senator whose mother wrote him a letter before he voted and said, essentially, Sonny, remember the women, remember the ladies, do the right thing. She was sick. And it passed in finally both houses of the Senate, of Congress in 1918, and then went out to the states, and that's a process, where 3/4 of the states have to agree on an amendment. And then there was joyful celebration by 20 million women, I think, in voting age in November they would have voted in 1920. So that's a long-winded answer, sorry. More work to be done.
I just have a comment on your very excellent presentation. The Women's Board of Trade here in town were also responsible for building the art museum. They were the ones that got behind it and promoted it. And I don't think Chris Wilson brings it up in his book on the myth of Santa Fe, but they were the ones that were really, I think, the boosters and the visionaries behind the way this town developed.
The Museum of Fine Arts now.
Yeah, my great-grandmother.
I'm sure you're right. I think there's a lot more to be discovered in the files, particularly reading newspaper accounts. The women's clubs were great at keeping scrapbooks. And actually in the 80s, when I was writing my dissertation on social housekeepers, one of my chapters is on women's clubs, and I spent many Wednesday afternoons out there on the Old Papers Trail at their clubhouse while they played bridge, going through their scrapbooks. And then when I came here recently to look at more materials, out come the scrapbooks. It sounds so quaint, you know, to have a scrapbook. But let me tell you, social historians like myself love them. They're so full of social history. You know, we have a lot of political history and news, but what's really happening comes out in these everyday kinds of activities. So I will be watching for them to see what their role was.
What's you said your great-grandmother?
Yeah, her name was Ruby Spees.
Spees?
Yeah, her,
I've seen that name.
Her-
She's on
her
the
name
plaque,
is-
isn't she?
yeah, she's on the plaque in the art museum.
Oh, there too. Yeah, I think she's on the one here.
Probably.
Yes, sir.
In other western states, Wyoming I know of, giving women the right to vote and serve on juries was part of the effort to gain statehood.
Yes, it was.
Was there anybody in New Mexico who saw this as perhaps a way of changing the image of New Mexico in similar ways
That's a good
in
question.
order to gain statehood?
Good question.
I mean, Colorado next door came to state when?
93?
No, Colorado's before that. Wyoming was 1890. Colorado was about 1850.
Well,
I
Wyoming,
believe.
69, Utah,
No,
71.
no, I'm talking about statehood.
Oh, so sorry, yes.
1870.
No, they were statehood by the time I think, yeah, might have been about 1890 or so. Yeah, so I don't know, that's a good question.
But nothing that you've done.
No, but I feel like I'm just beginning here, and some of you may have plenty more other leads. This woman's fair business is pretty interesting too, to see how that went, because there was a terrible struggle to even get a woman's building built for women in America to display or to be noticed for what they could do. So I'm sure that's another good story. Yes.
You started by quoting the woman from Kansas that if women could have the vote.
Genevieve Lane.
So I'm wondering what her rationale was. Does that appear in any of her work? Because obviously there's not a direct correlation between women supporting the right to vote and all those other things. So I'm curious what her rationale was.
Well, she was part of the women's movement by then. There were plenty of women that believed that the right to vote would mean that women would become equal citizens with men. Is that what you're asking about?
Well, I mean, you also commented about the first meeting back in, was it Seneca Falls? I don't know where, the meeting you talked about, and 40% of the audience didn't support.
Oh, and
You know, so obviously there
was
there's not a direct correlation between women supporting, you know.
Again, that was because of the cultural values of the era, a lot of anxiety by men, how that would change home life. You know, we aren't immune to it today since the women's movement,
sure.
the birth of the second women's movement in
So
the
I just
60s.
wondered if there was if this woman had some other reason for thinking women would
Would
get
help get
statehood,
statehood.
because obviously 100% of the women wouldn't in Kansas or New York or wherever. So I thought maybe you were going to come around to say there was something unique about New Mexico women or something that was happening in New Mexico that would support, you know, statehood and the right to vote.
Jensen wrote quite a bit about suffrage in New Mexico after statehood, so I didn't use too much of her information. But Nina Terrell Warren was a major figure here. Now she was of a political family. She was the niece of Solomon Luna, a major politician. I want to, go into her story too to see what it is about her. I mean, we are a state by the time she really finds her voice, which is in the mid-teens. So I don't know. It's another thread to follow up on. Thank you. Well, I don't want to keep you. You may still be planning to have lunch. Thanks for coming.